The trial of the captives, the great chamber of judgment, was a place where silence carried more weight than sound. Thousands of eyes, bright and alien, watched from the high tiers that circled the hall. The walls shimmered with cold silver light, and above the captives, long banners of the tribunal swayed like shadows of power. The prisoners were brought forward one by one, dragged in chains that rattled against the stone floor. No one spoke for them, no one pleaded for them. Every captive knew the rule of this place. No trial ended in mercy. Death was the only verdict. Among the prisoners stood one who looked unlike the rest. He was human, the only one of his kind in the long row of defeated beings. His wrists were tied with metal cuffs, his head slightly bowed, his eyes steady and calm, though the weight of 1,000 stares pressed against him. Around him were warriors from worlds far stronger, bodies covered in armor-like skin, faces carved with fury and despair. They cried, they cursed, they begged. Yet the humans stayed quiet, and that silence unsettled more than all the noise of the others. The judges sat high upon a platform carved of black stone. Their voices rose in turns, deep and sharp, each announcing the charges of the prisoners. Worlds destroyed, battles lost, crimes against the Empire. Yet in the end, their words always led to the same line: sentenced to die. When the words fell on the human, there was a stir among the crowd. Many had never seen one before. They whispered of Earth, of a people thought extinct, scattered in wars long forgotten. To them, the sight of this man was strange and almost unreal, like a shadow pulled from an old story. In the middle tier of the chamber, sitting with the family of one of the judges, was a young girl. Her name was Lyra, and though her face carried the pale features of her kind, her eyes were wide, with a softness that did not match the cruelty of the hall. She watched the captives with a quiet tension, her small hands gripping the railing before her. She had been taught all her life that the captives were dangerous, that their end was justice, that mercy was weakness. But as she looked at the human, something inside her stirred. He did not look like a monster. He did not look broken either. He looked alive in a way the others did not. The chamber darkened as the executions were declared. One by one, prisoners were dragged away, their voices fading into silence beyond the iron doors. The crowd did not cheer, for death here was no spectacle. It was ritual, cold and unchanging. Still, there was satisfaction in their eyes. Every death, they believed, made the Empire stronger. Every captive erased was a threat removed forever. Yet as the human stood waiting for his turn, his stillness drew more eyes. Why did he not cry? Why did he not beg? Lyra leaned forward, her heart beating faster. She had seen fear in many faces before, but here she saw something else. His eyes, dark and steady, lifted for just a moment, and though chains bound him, he seemed freer than all those around him. She felt as if he was not standing in judgment, but watching everyone else instead, as if he carried a secret none of them understood. It was only a glance, but it struck her deeply. She could not look away. The judge beside her, her father, noticed her unease. He spoke in a low voice, firm and dismissive. Do not let his silence fool you. Humans are dangerous. Their kind once burned half the skies before we crushed them. This one is no different. The law is clear. He will die. His words were final, spoken with the weight of authority. Lyra nodded, but inside her thoughts did not quiet. Dangerous, he had said, but all she saw was a man who looked tired yet unbroken. When the executioner moved closer to take him, a hush swept the hall. Something about this moment felt different, though none could say why. Perhaps it was the rare sight of a human. Perhaps it was the quiet defiance in his gaze. Whatever it was, the air seemed heavier, as if the whole chamber held its breath. Lyra gripped the railing tighter. She told herself it was foolish to care, that he was just another prisoner, another enemy. Yet the thought pressed into her mind again and again. If he truly was dangerous, then why did he not fight or curse? If he truly was weak, then why did he stand so calmly while death crept closer? The contradiction unsettled her. The human lifted his head fully now, his eyes meeting the high platform where the judges sat. He did not speak, but the look he gave was not of surrender. It was the gaze of someone who carried a truth larger than chains, a gaze that whispered of something Empire had forgotten. Lyra's breath caught, and she knew then that this was no ordinary captive. Something about him did not fit the script of death that had been written for every other prisoner before him. The gavel of the tribunal struck, echoing like thunder. The sentence was clear: the human was to die with the rest. The guards stepped forward to lead him to the dark gates of execution. The crowd began to shift, ready for the next name to be called. But Lyra did not move. She sat frozen, her eyes locked on the human as he was pulled toward his end. She could not explain why, but in that moment she felt as though the course of everything was turning, and she stood on the edge of a choice she did not yet understand. For the first time in her life, she felt the pull of defiance against the law she had been raised to honor, and deep inside, she knew one thing with certainty. If death was meant to silence every voice, then this one voice could not be silenced. The halls beyond the chamber of judgment were darker than night, lined with iron doors and guarded by figures who never spoke. Every captive taken from the tribunal was led down these corridors, and none had ever returned. The air was thick with the cold smell of stone and oil, and the sound of chains scraping across the floor echoed endlessly like the voice of doom. Among those being dragged that day was the human, his wrists bound, his steps steady despite the weight of his fate. Lyra walked beside her father as they left the main chamber, her small frame lost in the wide robe of her station. Her father's face was set in stone, unmoved by the cries of the prisoners that faded behind them. He spoke to her in the tone of a teacher, firm and absolute. "You must learn to see death as justice, Lyra. Mercy weakens the empire. When one captive is spared, rebellion grows in the hearts of many. We cannot allow it." His words pressed heavily upon her, but she only nodded in silence, yet her thoughts betrayed her calm face. They circled again and again around the image of the human. His eyes had not begged, nor had they burned with hatred. Instead they carried something else, something she could not name, but could not dismiss. That quiet strength lingered in her mind, stronger than all the cries and curses she had heard from others. It was as if he had planted a question in her heart simply by standing still. That night, when the halls had quieted and the guards took their posts in routine boredom, Lyra could not sleep. The shadows in her chamber seemed restless, and the whispers of the day would not leave her. She thought of the man chained in the darkness below, waiting for dawn when his life would be taken. She wondered what he thought of in those last hours, if he feared, if he regretted, or if he carried some secret strength that none around him could understand. Against all reason, she rose from her bed and wrapped herself in a cloak. Her feet carried her silently through the quiet passages of the fortress, her heart pounding with every step. She told herself she only wished to see him once more, to understand why he unsettled her so deeply. But inside she knew she was crossing a line from which she could not return. The cells were silent as she entered, the air heavy with despair. She passed rows of captives whose eyes were hollow, their spirits already broken. Yet when she reached the last door, where the human sat alone in chains, she felt something change. He was awake, his back straight, his gaze lifting to meet hers, as if he had been waiting. The flickering light of the torch painted his face with shadows, but his eyes were clear, sharp, alive. "You should not be here," he said in a calm voice. Not harsh but steady, the voice of one who knew truth more than fear. Lyra froze, unsure how to answer. She had expected him to remain silent or to curse her, but his tone disarmed her. I wanted to see you," she whispered, her words trembling in the still air. He studied her for a long moment before replying. "You are the judge's child. If they find you here, both of us will pay." His words carried no panic, no plea for help, and that only drew her closer. She stepped nearer to the bars, lowering her voice as if she feared the stones themselves might listen. "Why do you not cry out like the others? Why do you not beg for life?" He tilted his head, his gaze fixed on her as though he weighed her question carefully. "Because life is not given by begging," he said slowly. "It is held by those who refuse to let go. The others cry because they believe hope is gone. But hope does not come from the mercy of a judge. It comes from within." His words settled into her like a spark in dry grass. She had never heard anyone speak so. All her life she had been taught that power flowed downward, from the tribunal to the people, from the judges to the captives. Yet here was one who spoke as though power rose upward, from the heart, from will itself. "You speak as if you do not fear death," she murmured. He smiled faintly, though his chains clinked with the smallest shift of his arms. "Everyone fears death, but fear is not the master of me. I have lived with it long enough to know it can be faced without surrender." Lyra felt her breath catch. She had come seeking answers, but the more he spoke, the less certain she became of her own beliefs. His calmness was more powerful than any display of strength she had seen among her people. It was not defiance for its own sake. It was something deeper, a steadiness that seemed unshaken by the weight of judgment. "I should leave," she whispered, stepping back, yet her feet did not move. "If my father finds me, then you must decide," he said, his voice low but firm. "Do you walk away and let the world continue as it is, or do you listen to what your heart is telling you? You saw something in me today. I saw it in your eyes. You know, death is not always justice. Sometimes it is only fear wearing the mask of law." His words pierced her, stirring feelings she could not explain. She wanted to argue, to say that the law was sacred, that the empire stood strong because it showed no mercy, but her lips could not form the words. The image of him standing calm among the broken captives returned, and she realized he was right. She had seen something. Her father and the others chose to ignore. The sound of footsteps in the corridor broke her thoughts. She panicked, pulling her cloak tighter, but the human only leaned back against the wall, closing his eyes as though nothing could disturb him. She fled quietly, her heart racing, yet her mind burned with his words. The next day dawned with the usual ceremony of executions. The prisoners were led toward the square where their lives would end before the eyes of the people. Lyra stood beside her father once again, but her hands trembled within her sleeves. When the human was brought forward, silence swept the crowd. Every gaze fixed upon him, curious, fearful, eager for the rare sight of a human's death. The executioner raised his blade, and the chant of the crowd began to rise. But before the final command could be given, a small voice broke the rhythm. Lyra stepped forward, her voice carrying louder than she thought possible. "Spare him," she cried, her heart pounding in her chest. The crowd gasped. Her father turned with fury, and the executioner froze in confusion. Never before had a judge's child spoken in such defiance. Never before had mercy been demanded in the square of death. The tribunal rose in outrage, voices clashing, yet the girl stood firm, her eyes locked on the human dot, and in that moment, for the first time in generations, the law trembled. Secrets of humanity, the square of judgment did not echo with the sound of a blade that day. Instead it rang with the silence of disbelief. The crowd, thousands gathered in tight rows, stood frozen as the young girl's voice hung in the air. Her cry to spare the human had cracked the rhythm of law itself, and nothing felt steady anymore. The judges roared with anger, their voices thundering down, but the words of the child had already sunk deep into the ears of the people. A human had been marked for death, and yet a girl who should have obeyed without question had defied them all. The executioner faltered, his grip on the blade uncertain. No law guided him in such a moment, for the law had never imagined such defiance. The guards shifted uneasily, looking to the high platform for orders, but confusion broke the chain of command. In the end, the judges did not allow the execution to continue, not because they intended mercy, but because they feared the chaos of the people if they ignored such a public cry. They ordered the human to be returned to the cells, his death postponed until order was restored. The crowd murmured, torn between shock and curiosity, and whispers spread quickly through the city. That night, the fortress was heavy with unrest. The judges gathered in secret, voices sharp and filled with fury. They spoke of discipline, of punishing the girl, of erasing the human quietly to silence the growing whispers. Yet outside the walls of their chamber, the story had already taken life. Servants carried it, guards repeated it, and soon every street knew of the human who had been spared by the voice of a child. Lyra sat in her chamber, her heart still racing from the moment she had stepped forward. She had not planned it, had not thought beyond the beating of her heart, but when the blade had risen above the man, she could not remain silent. Now she trembled with fear of what might come, yet beneath that fear burned something stronger. A flame that no scolding words from her father could extinguish. She had done what she felt was right, and though the world shook around her, she did not regret it. In the deep hours of the night, she slipped once more into the shadows of the prison corridors. The guards no longer ignored her presence. They watched her with wary eyes, yet none dared challenge the daughter of a judge. When she reached the human cell, she found him awake as before, his gaze calm as though he had known she would return. "You risked everything today," he said, his voice low but steady. "I could not let them kill you," she whispered, her hands clutching the bars. "It was wrong. I do not know why, but I felt it in my heart." The human's eyes softened, and he leaned closer so his words reached only her. "You felt it because truth is stronger than fear. They teach you that mercy is weakness, but the greatest strength is to spare when you could destroy. It takes more courage to protect life than to take it away." Lyra listened with wide eyes, her chest rising with each breath. "You speak of courage as if it belongs to everyone, not only to warriors." "It does," he said firmly. "My people learned long ago that survival does not belong to the strongest alone. We endured storms, wars, hunger, even the silence of the stars. We did not survive because we crushed others. We survived because we held each other, because we refused to give up even when all seemed lost. That is what makes us human." She closed her eyes for a moment, letting his words sink deep into her. Never had she heard such ideas. Her people glorified power, obedience, and the rule of fear. Yet here was a man who claimed strength was found in unity, in holding on, in hope. It turned her world upside down, and yet it felt more true than anything she had been taught. Days that followed were restless. The judges tried to silence the whispers, but the story of the spared human grew like fire. Some scoffed and said it was only a child's foolishness. Others began to question what made the human so different. That even the blade had paused above his head. The guards who watched him whispered of his calm, of his unbroken spirit, and soon curiosity spread among the people, that not all welcomed it. There were those who hated the thought of a human still breathing within their walls. They remembered the old wars, the legends of human defiance that had once brought the empire to its knees. To them, this man was a seed of danger, a shadow of the past that could rise again. Some whispered of ending him in secret, away from the eyes of the people, to prevent rebellion before it could begin. Lyra sensed the danger. Each night she visited, And each night she urged him to tell her more of his people, of Earth, of how they lived. He spoke of rivers that carried songs of water, of skies painted in colors no artist could capture, of families that gathered around fire not only for warmth, but for the joy of stories. He spoke of losses too, of wars that broke hearts but never crushed their spirit. His words painted pictures so vivid that Lyra felt she could see them through his eyes. And with every story she understood more clearly why the Empire feared his kind. "You are dangerous," she whispered one night, though her voice trembled not with fear but with awe. He looked at her carefully, his lips curving in a faint smile. "Not because I hold a weapon. I am dangerous because I remind them that they can be more than chains. Fear holds them, not law. If even one remembers hope, the whole empire trembles." His words unsettled her, yet at the same time they strengthened her resolve. She began to see her own people with new eyes, their power built not on justice, but on the silencing of voices. And the more she saw, the more she knew she could not let him be taken away. It was on the 6th night after his postponed execution that the danger became real. Lyra slipped into the corridor as always, but she found the guards uneasy, their faces tense. When she reached his cell, she froze. The door had been opened, and 2 men stood inside with blades drawn, their intent clear. The human stood with his chain still binding him, but his stance was ready, his eyes sharp. "Stop!" Lyra cried, rushing forward before she could think. The guards turned in shock, unprepared for her sudden presence. Her voice rang with authority she had never used before. "By order of my blood, you will stand down." The guards hesitated, their blades trembling, for though they could silence a prisoner, they could not defy the daughter of a judge without risking their own lives. Reluctantly they lowered their weapons, but their eyes burned with anger as they withdrew. The human looked at her, his face calm though his life had hung by a thread. "You saved me again," he said quietly. Her chest heaved with the rush of fear, but she met his gaze with a steadiness she had never known in herself before. "I will not let them take you. I do not know what will come, but I cannot let you die." In the silence that followed, their bond deepened, unspoken yet unbreakable. She had crossed the line fully now, not with a cry in the square, but with a choice in the shadows, a choice that could not be hidden from the eyes of fate. And somewhere beyond the walls of the fortress, whispers of rebellion began to stir, whispers born from the story of a girl and the human she had spared. The uprising the fortress no longer felt steady. Its walls had once seemed unshakable, the stone rising high and cold above the city like a symbol of eternal rule, but now cracks ran through the silence of its halls. The whispers of the spared human had grown too strong to be ignored. Markets buzzed with questions, homes filled with quiet talk. Even the guards muttered among themselves when they thought no one listened. A child had cried for mercy, and the law had faltered. And in that falter, people saw a chance that the world was not as fixed as they had been told. The judges fought to bury the unrest. They issued proclamations declaring the girl foolish, declaring that the human was a trickster who would soon be put to death. Yet the more they spoke, the less their words carried weight. Fear clung to their voices, and the people could hear it. They knew their leaders were shaken. Something had been broken, and no decree could mend it. Lyra felt the tension pressing upon her like a storm. Her father's anger had grown each day, his voice sharper, his hand heavy upon the table when he spoke of duty and obedience. He warned her to keep silent, to remember her place, but she could not unsee what she had seen. The human's calm face, his words of hope, his stories of a people who endured without surrender, these had taken root in her heart, and no threat could pull them out. In the cell below, the human waited, his patience steady as ever. When Lyra visited, he spoke not of fear but of preparation. He knew the judges would not wait forever. The whispers were spreading too fast, and soon they would seek to end him openly to remind the people of their power. But he also knew something else, something Lyra had not yet heard. One night, when the torches burned low and the guards dozed in their chairs, he told her a truth that made her blood run cold. Your leaders fear us because they remember. Long ago, when my people were strong, we did not conquer for greed. We resisted. When their armies came, when they tried to break us, we would not kneel. They crushed us in the end, but only after losing more than they had ever lost before. They erased us from the records, called us extinct, so their people would forget that. Resistance is possible. That is why every captive is killed without question. It is not about justice. It is about silence. They fear that the memory of humanity might rise again. Lyra trembled as his words sank in. The law she had been taught. To worship was not protection but chains, and the executions were not punishment, but erasure. Her father and the other judges had built their empire upon fear of one truth, that humans, though broken, had shown the galaxy that power could be resisted. You mean, she whispered, her hands gripping the bars of his cell, that they kill you not because of what you have done, but because of what you are. He nodded slowly. Because of what I remind them they could lose again. Her heart ached, and for the first time she saw her father's eyes, not as strong but as desperate. Everything made sense now, the haste to execute, the fury at her defiance, the endless whispers of danger attached to one chained man. The human was not dangerous for his strength, but for the memory of strength he carried. The next day, the tribunal gathered the people in the square. They declared that the time for delay had ended, that the human would be executed before all eyes to prove that the empire was unshaken. Soldiers lined the streets, their armor glinting, their weapons ready. The crowd came not with cheers, but with unease. They had come to see not justice, but the measure of their ruler's fear. Lyra stood among the officials, her heart pounding, her mind racing. She had thought of nothing else all night. If she let the execution happen, the memory of hope would die with him. If she spoke again, she might be cast aside, punished, silenced forever. The choice tore at her, but she knew there was no more time. The human was brought forward, chains rattling, face steady as always. He walked as though the ground beneath him was no more frightening than a quiet field. The executioner raised his blade, the judges lifted their voices, and the moment of death drew near. But before the command could fall, a cry rose from the crowd, not from Lyra this time, but from the people themselves. "Spare him," someone shouted, then another voice, and another, until the chant grew into a wave. "Spare him." The judges shouted for silence, the soldiers raised their weapons, but the people did not stop. The human stood in the center, surrounded by chains, yet it was the empire that trembled. Lyra felt the weight of the moment press upon her. She stepped forward, her small figure breaking the line of officials, and she shouted again, her voice joining the people. "He must live. You fear him not because he is guilty, but because he carries truth." Chaos erupted. The soldiers moved to seize the human, but in the confusion he shifted, chains clattering as he struck with sudden force. He did not fight like a beast, but with sharp precision, every movement turning weakness into advantage. A guard fell, then another, and the chains that bound him became weapons in his hands. The crowd roared, surging forward, and for the first time in generations, the fortress of the judges felt the push of rebellion. Lyra rushed to his side as he broke free from the last of his bonds. Together they pushed through the wave of soldiers, the people rising behind them. Blades clashed, voices thundered, and the air filled with the fire of defiance. The human led not with brute strength, but with cunning, turning the lines of the empire against themselves, using every gap, every slip, every chance. At last they reached the outer gates, but there the tribunal stood waiting, their robes black. Against the light, their eyes filled with fury. The chief judge raised his voice above the noise. Do you not see what he is? He is the enemy of our past. Humanity once brought us to the edge of ruin. To spare him is to invite destruction again. The words fell heavy, and for a moment the crowd wavered. The revelation that humans had once nearly destroyed the empire struck like a hammer, and fear rippled through the people. But the human stood tall, his voice carrying over the fear. We did not seek conquest. We only refused to kneel. They call that ruin, but I call it freedom. If you believe strength is only in chains, then you will never know what it means to truly live. The silence that followed was deeper than any decree. In that silence, the people began to see the truth for themselves, and the judges, for the first time, knew their grip on power was slipping. The revelation and resolution, the square that had once been a place of fear, now thundered with voices that could not be silenced. The tribunal judges stood tall in their black robes, but their power no longer seemed untouchable. The humans' words lingered in the air, carried by the breath of the crowd, and in those words the people saw a reflection of themselves they had never dared to look upon. The chains of the empire had always been hidden behind the mask of justice. Yet now the mask was torn away, and all that remained was fear, the fear of a truth too dangerous to admit. Lyra stood beside the human, her small frame fragile against the tide of soldiers, but her eyes were steady. Her father glared at her with fury and disbelief, his voice breaking with rage as he shouted for her to step back, to remember her blood, to obey her place. Yet she did not move. She had chosen, and her choice stood stronger than his command. For the first time she understood that blood alone could not bind her. Truth had bound her to something greater. The chief judge raised his staff, his voice carrying above the crowd. This human is a shadow of ruin. His kind once rose against us, and in their defiance they nearly shattered the empire. We destroyed them to protect you, and now you see why. If he lives, if his words spread, all that we built will fall. The people shifted uneasily, caught between fear and hope, between the old story they had been told and the new one rising before them. The soldiers gripped their weapons, waiting for the order to strike, but none moved, for hesitation had crept into their ranks. Many had seen the human fight with chains, had seen his calm even in the face of death, and something about that sight had shaken their certainty. The human stepped forward, his voice rising, not with anger but with a steady strength that carried across the square. They call us ruin because we would not kneel. They call us danger because we dared to believe freedom belonged to every being, not only to the rulers, who hold power through fear. They fear me not because of what I have done, but because I remind them of what you could become. You are not weak. You are not bound by their chains unless you choose to be. The greatest strength is not in crushing others, but in standing together. The words rolled through the crowd like a wave. Mothers clutched their children, workers raised their heads, even the soldiers lowered their weapons slightly as doubt cracked the armor of obedience. Lyra felt the air shift around her, heavy yet alive, as though the whole city was taking its first breath after years of silence. Her father roared, his voice filled with desperation. Do not listen. He twists your minds with false hope. Without you are nothing. Without fear you will fall. But the people did not cheer for him. Their silence answered louder than any cry. It was the silence of hearts no longer convinced, of a power that no longer ruled unquestioned. The human turned, his eyes meeting Lyra's. In them she saw not victory but resolve, not vengeance but choice. He had been given the chance to strike back, to turn the people's anger into blood, yet he did not seek destruction. His voice, calm and steady, rose one last time. If you want me dead, kill me now. But know this, my death will not erase what you have already seen. You have felt it within yourselves. The choice is yours, not theirs. You decide if you will live in chains or stand free. The chief judge raised his staff to give the order, but his voice faltered. The soldiers did not move. The people did. Not Bo. The staff shook in his hands, and for the first time in all his years of power he saw his command ignored. The human stood unbroken, and the girl stood at his side. And in that image the empire saw its end. The crowd erupted, not with screams of fear but with cries of defiance. The soldiers dropped their blades. The people surged forward, and the tribunal was overwhelmed by the tide of voices they could not silence. The fortress that had once been a symbol of control became a cage for the rulers themselves. The people no longer feared them. When the sun set that day, the city was changed forever. The tribunal was dissolved, its power broken by the will of the crowd. The judges were cast out, not slain but stripped of the fear they had once worn like armor. The people chose a new path, uncertain yet alive, for the first time shaping their lives not by decree but by choice. Lyra and the human walked together beyond the square when the noise of the crowd finally softened. She looked at him, her eyes filled with questions, with wonder, with the weight of everything that had passed. "What will happen now?" she asked. He looked at the horizon where the sky stretched wide and open. "Now you learn what it means to live free. It will not be easy, freedom never is. But you have taken the first step, and no chain can bind you again once you have felt it break." She walked in silence beside him, her heart full of both fear and hope. She knew the path ahead would be hard, that there would be struggles, that not all would accept change, but she also knew that something greater had begun. A single choice, a single voice, had turned the course of an empire. As they passed through the gates of the fortress, the people looked upon the human not as a prisoner, but as a symbol, not of ruin, not of war, but of a truth too long buried, that strength lives not in power, but in the courage to stand, to endure, to hope. And though the future was unwritten, one truth was clear. Every captive had once been sentenced to die. But one young girl had spared a human, and in that act she had spared them all from silence. The memory of that day would live not as a shadow but as a light, carried from voice to voice, generation to generation, until the stars themselves remembered. The strength of humanity once more, the end.